This computer. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Robert Swartwood here. Tonight, I am joined by an author that doesn't really need any introduction, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. She is the internationally best-selling author who took an unusual route to a writing career. She's a graduate of Stanford University. She went on to medical school at the University of California, San Francisco, where she was awarded her MD. While on maternity leave from her work as a physician, she began to write fiction. And in 1987, her first novel, Call After Midnight, was published. It was just the first of 32 suspense novels that she's written over a 36-year writing career. She also wrote a screenplay, Adrift, which aired in 1993 CBS Movie. We can just go on. We can spend all this time. But anyway, it's Tess Gerritsen. Tess, how are you?
Hi, I am simply the poster child for longevity, for the benefits
Yes.
of longevity.
Yes, and that is definitely something we want to discuss as we were discussing in the green room a little bit earlier. But yeah, so your very first novel was published in 1987, Call After Midnight. Now, was that your first published novel or was that your first novel?
That was my first published novel. I had done two practice novels before that. That's not unusual for people to have their first and second and third, maybe their seventh novel rejected. But I think that those of us who are bound to be writers, are bound to make a lifetime of this, we don't know how to say, I give up. We just keep going, even if we have a whole drawer full of rejections.
Yeah, so were those okay? So the first several novels of your career were more, I guess, romantic suspense, would we call them?
Yes,
So
romantic
were
suspense.
so were those first two novels romantic suspense, or was that something that you tried maybe something different, and then your third, your one that was published was romantic suspense?
My first nine novels were all romantic suspense, and I can explain why.
Yeah.
I was working as a doctor, and one of my patients gave me a bag of books that she'd finished reading while she was in the hospital. And they were all romance novels. So I started reading them, and I was working 80 hours a week then. But I read them all. And I think that's why I wrote romance to begin with. I enjoyed reading them, and I think we should always write what we enjoy reading. So that's how I ended up. But one thing that was interesting is that all my romance novels had murders in them. So I should have known from the very beginning that I was really destined to be a suspense author.
And your very first thriller was Harvest, which obviously you dipped into your career as a doctor.
Mhm.
Because I was actually one of the other books that I'm reading currently on my Kindle is Harvest, and that one was a New York Times bestseller, correct? Like that was a
It
big book
was.
for you.
It was my first New York Times bestseller, my first hardcover. And I learned something from that. I learned to pay attention to I guess, what can I say? My internal organs when I'm hearing an idea. If you get what I call that punch in the gut, you think, oh my God, this story, it's really affecting me emotionally. That means it's going to be a big book, or that means it's going to be a big book for you. And that's what happened when I first heard the premise for Harvest. I was having dinner with a homicide detective. He'd been traveling in Russia, and the Moscow cops told him that kids were vanishing from the streets of Moscow. They thought they were being kidnapped and sent to the Middle East as organ donors. And that really horrified me because I had kids who were about that age to be organ donors. So when I couldn't stop thinking about it weeks later, I thought, this is my next book. I had been writing romance novels up to then. This was clearly not a romance novel. So it made me shift over to medical thrillers. I'd never written a medical thriller before, and that was my first.
Now, publishing obviously has changed a lot in the last couple decades. So I feel like nowadays, if you had written, a half dozen or more novels under the romantic suspense, then switching to thrillers, they might want you to, do a pen name or whatever else. So was there any concern or pushback when you initially, had written Harvest and then had gone out with that, like from your agent, you know what I mean, or any
Yeah.
publishers?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question because I think that you're right. They might ask you to change your name and just say you're a debut author because you get a lot more attention. Um, what they were thinking about was that I had an audience from Harlequin and Intrigue, that I could bring them over into my suspense. So they didn't want me to lose that audience, and that's why they allowed me to keep the name. And I'm really glad I did keep the name. I've only used Tess Gerritsen as my pen name all these years. But I think that nowadays, if you have a hard shift in genre, like suddenly you go to science fiction, or suddenly you write sports books, they might ask you to change your name, or you might think about changing your name, especially if your sales are starting to go down. That's another reason to change your name.
Absolutely. And as somebody who actively writes under a pen name as well, it always fascinates me when authors, playing around with their name. So Gerritsen is your real last name. Tess is not your given first name. Your real first name is
Terry with a
Ter
Y.
Terry with a Y.
Yeah, a
So what
male
was the idea
spelling.
to change? Yeah. So what was the idea then? How was Tess born?
Tess was born because I was writing romance, and I wanted to make sure my readers knew I was a woman and not a guy. And Terry with the Y is can be either. So that was the entire reason for it. I wanted to identify as a woman, and I think that if you're a male writing for romance, it's hard to sell.
Oh, absolutely. So I don't know if I personally don't watch sports, but I do like Rich Eisen. I always watch his clips on YouTube, especially the celebrity true or false. So some of the things that I was reading, I want to kind of do a celebrity true and false real here to see via
Okay.
Wikipedia. It says, while on maternity leave, she submitted a short story to a statewide fiction contest in the magazine Honolulu.
Honolulu.
Her first story on choosing the right crack seed won the first prize, and she received $500. The story focused on a young male reflecting on a difficult relationship with his mother. She claimed the story allowed her to deal with her own childhood turmoil, including the repeated suicide attempts of her mother. Is true or false?
True. True.
Wow.
That was a really important short story for me because I hadn't sold anything. And I didn't know if I could be a writer. I didn't know if I had what it took. And I'm more important, my husband didn't know if I had what it took. So I think winning that was a big boost to my confidence.
So when you had written that and submitted that, had you already written one of the first two novels that did not sell?
No, it was just like a short story
That
that
was
I
just a
threw out
short
to the
story.
children. Yeah. Yeah.
So with the short stories that you have, I mean, we had talked kind of in the green room a little bit. You've only written a handful of short stories. At those times, did you know those were your short stories, or maybe at the time did you think, "Oh, this is going to be my next book," and then when you actually started writing it, you realized, "No, this is definitely just going to be a short story," or vice versa.
Yeah, when I write a short story, I know it's going to be a short story because it's usually commissioned by for some collection, or there's a certain point to putting this in a short story collection. So I always know it's a short story, and it's a different it's a different process for me. I find short stories very hard to write because all of a sudden you've got to, everything has got to be compacted. Your character development has to be very quick. And your plots really can't be as complex as you could have in a novel. You asked me earlier how many short stories I've written, and I really can't tell you. I don't remember because when you do one or two a year after 30 years, maybe it's in the dozens. I have no idea.
Yeah. Well, one of them that you have written was an anthology that I had done over like a decade ago. Um, Called Hint Fiction. This was 25 word or fewer short stories based kind of inspired by the Hemingway 6 word short story. When the publisher had approached me about editing this, of course, one of the speculations was we need a lot of well-known authors in this book. So I reached out to a lot of authors that I enjoyed reading from. You were kind enough to submit a story to this. And again, I know when we were discussing earlier, you weren't really kind of familiar with the short story, so I was going to read it if that's okay.
Okay.
It's called The Lover's Regret. And it says, they are now grown up, the children I abandoned to be with you. They hate me, but not nearly as much as I hate you. Now, again, like you said, writing short stories are difficult. I've found sometimes even writing like a 25 word story is very difficult. Do you remember it all? Like, I'm assuming it was a challenge, or was it something that you were just able to knock out? Again, this has been a while, so I understand if you don't remember.
Yeah, it was a challenge, but for me, the most important thing is that I somehow touch an emotion. And in this case, it's regret. It's obviously regret because I mean, I was writing about somebody I knew who had left his children,
Mm.
and years later, sorely regretted it because he couldn't reconnect with them. And I always wondered what that second marriage was like. So it was that was the short story.
Yeah. No, it was great. Thank you again for contributing to it. Um, so another piece of trivia we have here was that you are the composer of a musical piece, Incendia, for violin and piano, a waltz that features in the plot of your novel, Playing with Fire. True or false?
That's true. And I can tell you how that whole thing came about. That was really
Yeah.
a strange book. Um, so I was in Venice for my birthday and had a little too much wine to drink, and I had a nightmare that night. And I dreamt that I was playing my violin. There was a baby sitting next to me, and as I was playing this music, the baby's eyes glowed red, and she turned into a monster. And I woke up and thought, oh, I don't know what this nightmare is, but there's a book in here. We writers are always going, there's a book in here. So I walked around Venice that day and ended up in the old Jewish quarter where there were these memorials to the 246 Jews from Venice who died in the Holocaust. And there was this wooden plaque with just names and ages. And I remember seeing a whole group of people with the same last name. And I thought, that's my story. So I wrote this book that's set in, it's got a dual timeline. One is the current day and one is 1930s Venice, just before the war. And it's about a piece of music that my modern day violinist buys in an old antique store in Rome. It's handwritten. She doesn't know who wrote it. She doesn't know this name, but she just knows that every time she plays this piece at home on her violin, her little girl goes berserk and does something horrible, like kills the cat or stabs her mom. So she needs to find out where this music came from. So in writing this short story or this novel, it's more of a novella. I had to describe this fictional piece of music, which didn't exist. And the description became so detailed that I feel like it must have seeped its way into my subconscious because halfway through writing the book, I had another dream and I woke up with the melody in my head that a melody of a piece that didn't exist until that moment. And I sat down at the piano and I just wrote out the music. And that's how the composition came. And that's how the story came. It was just both dreams. And to this day, I really kind of feel that it was almost handed to me by the universe.
Yeah, it is it's a great novel. I mean, it is a shorter novel. I think maybe the audio because I listened to the audiobook. Actually, I think I have it on Kindle too, but I listened to the audiobook. It's narrated by actually by two narrators. One of it's Julia Whalen, who is amazing. Anybody who listens to audiobooks knows Julia Whalen. And I was surprised because in the audiobook itself, it features violin music. And at the
Mhm.
time, I thought it was just some kind of, generic music that like something that they had found that was like, no copyright for, and that they just added to the audiobook. And then I read that, no, this was something that you had actually composed.
Yes, and what was great about it was that I know a music producer in London, and I sent him the music, and he said I know just the violinist to record it. So he brought on board a wonderful violinist from Canada named Suzanne Howe, and she called me. She hadn't read the book yet, but she had the music, and she called me from Paris where she was living, and she said I'm playing this music now. My window is open, and there's a crowd on the street listening below my window. Um, and I mean, there were so many eerie things about this project. So she recorded the music, and if anybody wants to hear it, they can go onto YouTube and look up "Playing with Fire" Incendio, violin music. And then she read the book, and she called me up later, and she goes, "This is really, really weird. In your book, you describe the violin that the Jewish violinist plays as built in this certain decade from Cremona, Italy." And she says, the music I recorded was on a violin that was made that decade in Cremona, Italy in the 1600s. So, it was just like all these things that came together. It seemed like it was all meant to be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it really is a very, very nice tune. I didn't mean to say generic as like it was, whatever else, but just, I just thought it was just some music they had just put down there. in the audiobook. I didn't realize that it was like, wow, something that you had actually written. Now that I don't want to give too much away of that novel, but I've always loved novels that they lead you, you started out, you think it's one thing, and then at a certain point it becomes a completely different thing.
Yeah.
So this was one of those novels where I don't know if it's really giving anything away. I mean, it's been out for a while now, but I
Yeah,
would
you go
almost
ahead.
say
Go ahead. Talk about
I
it.
would almost say it becomes almost like a conspiracy thriller. Would you agree
It
with that or not?
does.
But I mean,
Yeah, it's a
yeah,
crime novel. It's a conspiracy novel. It's a World War II novel, and
yeah.
it's also a novel that involves some neurology,
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah. But I mean,
some
starting out, you think
neuroscience.
it's one thing. Now, when you had sat down to write that, well, I guess we'll get into it. When you sit down to write a book, is that one of those things where you really have a good sense of where that book is going to go, how it's going to end? Do you
Mhm.
outline, or is it kind of like a you just sit down and with maybe a first chapter in mind and just kind of see where things go?
I just see where things go. I've never outlined a book, or let's say it. I've never successfully outlined a book. I tried to outline it, always falls apart.
Yeah.
That book, Playing with Fire, that was one of the weird books that I knew from the very beginning what happens. I didn't need to outline it because it was like the map was right in front of me, at least mentally. I mean, I knew the tragic ending of the Jewish violinist. And I knew that the current day violinist, what was going on in her mind, why things were falling apart for her, which isn't revealed until like almost the last couple of chapters.
Yeah.
So that was one of the easy ones. In fact, that was probably the quickest book I've ever written, was that particular novel.
It moves really fast. I will say that. I was one of those listening to the audiobook. I mean, I just, yeah, just, it was very compelling. It was a great book. So, okay, well, let's go obviously to one of your more famous books, the Rizzoli and Isles books. The very first novel was The Surgeon. Um, by the time you wrote The Surgeon, how many other crime thriller type novels, after Harvest had you written?
There were four novels before The Surgeon. I wrote Harvest, Life Support, Bloodstream, and Gravity. Although Gravity is not a crime novel, that was science fiction.
Right.
Um,
And
so
then going
uh,
back to just the diversity though, like having, then written some, some medical thrillers, like, did you ever get any pushback at all? Then all of a sudden being like, okay, I'm going to write, I'm going to write Gravity. I'm going to write this science fiction
I
novel.
don't know. I know I didn't. I mean, because my first three novels were medical thrillers, and Gravity was actually a medical thriller. It just happened to take place in
In
space.
space. Yeah.
Yeah, so it still fit the genre, even though there was no crime involved. And I remember when I described it, what I was going to write, everybody was very excited. They thought, well, this sounds really cool. This is Michael Crichton-esque, which is what they were looking for.
Mm.
And I think that's how it turned out, but very much along the lines of Michael Crichton.
And then you wrote The Surgeon, the
Mhm.
first Rizzoli and Isles book, which
Yeah.
became, we had talked about 13 books in total. That series had 13 books in total. However, when you wrote The Surgeon, did you have any idea that you would be writing even a second book?
No, it was a one-off. It was supposed to be a one-off. And this is, I get pushback from a lot of people going, why do you call it Rizzoli and Isles? But it's only Rizzoli in that first book. And why is Rizzoli such a bitch? Why is she so hard to like? And I can just say, because Rizzoli was supposed to die in that book. She was not the main character. There was a woman surgeon who was actually the main character in The Surgeon. Um, but as I was writing the character of Jane Rizzoli, I didn't feel the need to make her likable because I was going to sacrifice her. She was not going to survive that book. But as the story went on, I got to like her. And this is funny about secondary characters, and I hear this from other authors. The secondary character that you're not thinking too much about is allowed to develop almost spontaneously. They come to life on their own without us planning anything. And that's what happened with Jane. So by the end of the story, I thought, yeah, you're a bitch, but I really understand why you are. I like you. I want to know what happens to you next. And I didn't kill her. She survived that book. And then I thought, okay, I want to know what happens to Jane next. And that's where The Apprentice came in. And in that book, I introduced Maura Isles, secondary character. She started to take over the book. And I thought, I need to write about Maura Isles now. So I wrote the third book, which was The Sinner. And then I had a series.
At what point did they, because I'm sure, even before then, you'd always had film, TV interest, but at what point did you really have serious film, TV interest for this series?
I think it was after Body Double, that so the fourth, somewhere around the fourth to the fifth book. That's when a producer reached out to my agent in LA and said, and this is what he said, and it's interesting because I know we all think, oh, you have a great plot, it'll make a great movie. He didn't say anything about the plots. He said, I love your girls. And that's an indication that they're all looking for characters. They just want character. They don't really care so much about the crime.
True. I've heard that characters, sometimes just the idea. A lot of authors now are just selling short stories to Hollywood because they don't really, the studios don't really care about the plot or like the whole storyline. They just like the, what's that pitch? Well, what's that idea? So, okay, so you were about 4 or 5 books in. At that point, did you, like, you obviously knew it was a series. Did you already have, how far ahead were you thinking that in terms of the series? Did you have already ideas like, oh, I can maybe do at least another 2 books? Or at what point did you, I don't know. I mean, going 13 books is amazing, but I mean, at what point did you, I guess, can you just really kind of talk about, like you said before, you don't really outline, but I guess with a series, you kind of had at least an idea of, what future books could potentially be.
Oh, no, I didn't. I didn't have any character arcs planned out. They just happened.
Yeah.
And this is the advantage of writing a series that has a large universe of characters because everybody's going through something in their lives. And so if you get tired of Jane's story, you can go to Maura's story, or you can go to Jane's mother's story. So I had Jane and her mom, I had Jane's partner, I had Maura, who's falling in love with a Catholic priest. I mean, that's the whole short story there. And then there's Jane's parents who are going through a divorce. So it's a very much a sort of a group story. And I think of it as a bunch of friends. You want to see what happens to your friends. And over 13 years, a lot of changes happen. And I never really planned out any of these arcs. For instance, Body Double is where Maura Isles discovers she had a twin sister. She didn't know she was adopted. And the twin sister only becomes known to her when the corpse shows up on her doorstep. So her twin sister shows up dead in her yard, and that's when she discovers she has a twin. Um, did I know she was an identical twin? I did not know she was an identical twin, but I did know in the third book, The Sinner, that she was adopted. Why did I put that in there? I have no idea. It was just a throwaway detail. And we are, as writers, we're always unconsciously planting the gun on the mantelpiece. We don't know we're going to use it later. But let your subconscious plant guns everywhere, or plant things that you might use in book 4 or 5 or 6. They will come back to help you.
So, so with just sitting down and writing the book, how often do you, I mean, you've written now, how many novels would we say you've written? Did I mention before in your
32.
bio? 32.
Yeah,
And we had
32.
discussed a little bit beforehand that obviously, writing, even after all this time, writing is difficult. I don't know why some people think like, oh, it's very easy. You just sit down. I mean, it is, I guess, in a way, one word after another word, but still it's work. It's tough. Um, if you sit down though, I mean, are there times where you might end up writing like 50 pages or 100 pages? You might go off in one direction and then realize at a certain point, this isn't going to work. And then you have to backtrack and then basically just throw out those chapters, or, I mean, or do you just try to make those work? Or, I mean, have you ever run into that?
I throw away stuff all the time. I probably have every book of mine, probably I write twice as many pages as actually ends up in the book because I'm tossing so much.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of the times it's like I'll get halfway through the story and I think it's not working and I don't know why it's not working. And then I'll realize that there's another direction I should have taken. So the first 100 pages goes out. But that's the consequence of not working with an outline. You're always going in blind directions that don't work out.
Yeah. No, I don't like to outline either. We for my Avery Bishop book, we had sold something to Audible Original based on an outline. It was supposed to be a novella. And then once we sold it and once I sat down and started writing it, I realized the only way to make this effective is I have to do a whole other point of view. And then it became like
Yeah.
double the length of what we had said it was going to
Right.
be. Now, fortunately, they were okay with that. But
Yeah.
but yeah, like, yeah, so I like just kind of letting the story to, go where it goes. Absolutely. So what is your writing process typically like? Do you try to write every day? Is it just and when you do, is it just you try to do like a chapter a day, a few thousand words? I mean, or does that vary just, book by book?
It varies depending on what time of the year it is. If it's summertime, I'm not going to write as much because I'm out there in my garden. Um, and if I get close to deadline, then I'll write a little faster. If I don't know what's going on or I've got writer's block, I will not write for weeks. Um, but if I have a good writing day, it's pretty much just breakfast, take a walk, sit down, write 1,000 words. That's what I try to do. And I'm feeling pretty good today because I wrote 1,000 words. So you
Nice.
got me on a good day. You didn't get me on a day when I'm just kicking the wall.
So do you try to do like a chapter at a time, or are there times where you might be like halfway through a chapter and just say, okay,
Uh, a,
that's it,
a scene at a time.
a scene at a time? Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
I mean, some chapters have several scenes.
Well, going to one of the more interesting, or I mean, I guess I want to say weird, but okay, you did this project called 14 Days, which is a collaborative novel that was edited or I guess put together by Margaret Atwood and Douglas Preston.
Yeah.
I'm looking here on Amazon. It says set in the Lower East Side tenement in the early days of COVID-19 lockdown, 14 Days and is an irresistibly propulsive collaborative novel from the Authors Guild with an unusual twist. Each character in this diverse, eccentric cast of New York neighbors has been secretly written by a different major literary voice. So how was this? I mean, when they came to you with this project, how did they pitch it? You know what I mean? Like, it's just very, I mean, and like, how did that work? Was there like, I guess, was there an outline there? I mean, what kind of leeway did
No,
you have?
we had all the leeway in the world. I was told by Doug Preston, we just have people telling stories. Just tell a story and we'll figure out how to link them all together. So that's all we did. He made it really easy for us. So, I mean, we could all write our own story. The only thing that I felt compelled to do is I knew that took place in the time of COVID. I knew it took place when New York was under siege by this disease. So I wrote a book. I wrote a short story that was relevant to the time. And actually, my short story is a true story. Um, it's a story about when I was working as a doctor, and it's a kind of an eerie story in that um, there was a nun at the Catholic hospital where I was working, and she always knew when somebody was going to die. I mean, you would see her do this. She'd just go to a bed and she'd do this. And you'd think, what is that all about? And I found out later it's because she sensed this person was going to die. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they were particularly sick. She just seemed to know. So I found that a very eerie sort of story, and I put that in 14 days. And that how helpful it would be during the era of COVID to know which patient to spend all your time trying to save and which patient you knew was going to die. If you knew which ones were going to die, you would move your resources to those who could survive.
Yeah. Yeah. So we want to get to your new novel and your new series. Before we do that, though, this past Thriller Fest, um, you were a thriller master. You and several other novels, I think, or novels. You and several other authors were there. Uh, Dennis Lee Hayne was another one. Your speech, you discussed. Um, just the idea of longevity. And you had told this really great story, which actually reminded me, did you ever read the Stephen King short story? It was very similar. I think it was like a first person point of view of somebody on like a morgue table.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, that was an old one. I forget what that one was called, but yeah, it was basically, they think he was dead. But yeah, so the whole thing was this idea about just, certain, I guess, with I guess author careers, oftentimes writing is difficult. Publishing is even more difficult because just maintaining a readership, maintaining viability in publishing is very difficult. You walk through a used bookstore, you're going to inevitably come across authors who probably had won some awards, were maybe on some bestseller lists, and then but they haven't published a book in like a decade or whatever else, and you never hear from them again. So, I mean, you've been publishing books now for, it was like 1987, correct? Was your very first novel. So, which is, it's incredible. And that you've just maintained, and it's not like some authors whose careers kind of start just, there's no readership and they just start, being published in by small press. I mean, you continue being published by major publishers, hitting New York Times, hitting bestseller lists and everything else. So getting to that, and I'm sure there's probably no secret to it, but I mean, Do you have, I mean, what would you say in terms of that longevity? How would you think that you've just maintained that, this a brilliant career after all these years and decades?
Well, there are several parts to longevity. One of them is obviously living long enough. The the other is maintaining your creative drive. I think a lot of people stop publishing because they just get pooped out and they just don't have any more ideas and they're tired and they're discouraged and they just think, well, I could make more money doing something else. Those of us who maintain the creative drive, we just can't stop writing, and we probably wouldn't stop writing even if we couldn't sell another book. And I always say that to my husband, even if I never sold another book, I would still be writing. So how do you maintain that creative drive? For me, it was doing things out of the box. So yes, I wrote 13 Rizzoli Isles books. And by the end of it, I was ready to be like Conan Doyle, to kill my main characters. I didn't want Sherlock Holmes alive anymore. And sometimes Jane would just annoy me. So what I did was I wrote other books in between. I had the standalone. So while I was writing Rizzoli Isles, I wrote a book called The Bone Garden, which was a historical set in 1830s Boston. I wrote a book called uh, isn't it terrible? I'm forgetting the titles of my stories.
You've written so
The
many,
Shape of
it's completely
the
understandable.
shape of the shape of night, which everybody's going, what the hell was that book about? It was a sexy ghost story. I mean, who knew I was going to write a ghost story? And then I wrote Playing with Fire. So those are three books that are completely out of the series, but they were different enough and interesting enough for me that it kind of like refreshed me, and then I could go back to Jane and Maura. Now, the downside of doing that is that those books never sell as well. And the books that are out of series, nobody knows what to do with them. I mean, what would you do with a historical novel? A lot of readers don't like historicals. The sexy ghost story, oh, a lot of readers were really upset about the sex because there was a lot of sex. And then Playing with Fire, of course, was upsetting because it was about the Holocaust. But it was important for me. Every one of those books was important for me creatively. So that's one part of this. That's one part of the equation. The other part is the publishing world. Are they going to allow you to do these wild and crazy things, or write a ghost story? They weren't happy about it. I know that they kept thinking, what is this? We know we're not going to sell as many copies, but they wanted more Rizzoli Isles, so they did publish those books. And I'm proud of every single one of those novels. I knew that they were not going to sell as many copies, but it was something I needed to do. And I was lucky enough to have a publisher who wanted the next Rizzoli Isles book enough to be able to indulge me in these other projects. Now, then I wrote The Spy Coast, which was again another completely weird departure, and now I'm writing spy novels. But that was helped by the fact that Amazon was very, very interested in the story, and that's how I ended up getting published by Thomas and Mercer, because it was that plus a television deal that got put together.
Yes, and we're going to get to Spy Coast very shortly, but that reminded me, you had done a previous novel with Thomas and Mercer, correct? It was a collaborative
Oh
novel.
yeah, it was a collaborative novel. I almost forgot about that
How did
novel.
that one come about?
That was a cocktail party novel. I was at a cocktail party with my good friend Gary Braver. It was a Christmas party. It was just before COVID hit, and it was the Me Too movement was like in the news. And I said to Gary, I'm always kind of like the person who likes to go in the other. I'm the fish that goes in the other direction. Everybody's on Me Too. I want to write a Me Too novel told from the point of view of the man, a twist on the Me Too story. So I said, what if we had a university professor who's very naughty, who has an affair with one of his students, obviously bad, bad thing to do, and he's married, and she ends up murdered, the student girlfriend, and it becomes a crime novel. Now we're starting off, first of all, the very flawed hero, which is the professor, and we're starting off with the woman, the student, who is in a way a victim, but as the story unwinds, I wanted to also make her, the antagonist as well. So Gary and I thought, oh, that sounds like fun. Let's do it. And then we both went home and COVID hit, and we wrote the whole thing online. He would send me a chapter. I would send him back a chapter. We would react to each other's chapters, and that's how it came about. Now I think it was a very controversial novel because it was looking at a flawed man as the hero. But I thought that was what made it interesting. That yes, a man who's made a bad mistake can still be a hero in some way.
Was that the very first collaborative thing that you had done?
First collaborative novel I've ever done. Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, I know some authors who do that and they do it well. Other authors, it's like pulling teeth. I mean, did you enjoy that
Yeah.
process?
Yeah, it's hard. I think collaborative novels are more difficult than single author novels because you have to make the voices meld together. So the voice I was using was I was telling from the point of view of the female student who's dead. I mean, we're looking back at what happened, and he's telling the point of view from the professor. Um, and sometimes those voices were not really melding together well. So I did a complete rewrite of the whole thing just to make sure all the chapters fit together. And it probably took longer than a regular novel.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I can imagine. So, all right, so let's get to Spy Coast. And then, like The Surgeon, this was going to be was this intended to be a standalone?
Intended to be a standalone. It was. But then by the end of writing this, I was so fond of my characters, I wanted to see them back. And so were my editor and my agent. They all wanted to see these characters back in another story. And I think the thing that finally pushed me was that Amazon Studios bought it as a TV series, and they were immediately asking, "When's the next book in this series?" So I thought, I guess that's my go ahead to write a second book.
And so, just for those who have not read the book, I can't imagine there has been anybody who hasn't read the book yet. But what can you just kind of tell us a little bit about the
How it
Spy
started?
Coast and like how it came about?
Yeah, it came about because I moved to Maine. I moved to Maine 34 years ago. It's a little town here, and I discovered soon after moving here that I am surrounded by retired CIA. Uh, it came about because my husband has a medical practice, and a lot of his patients who are retirees would tell him that they used to work for the government, but they couldn't tell him about it. They couldn't talk about it. And it was a realtor who told us they're all retired spies. So over the years, I thought, I wonder what retired spies do. Do they get bored? Do they have book clubs? Do they have cocktail parties? And that's the basic plot of the Spy Coast is we have a group of spies here who are having to deal with the consequences of their past lives. And then they also join forces with the local police chief, who's a young woman, to solve a crime. And it's really, I think, a reflection of me getting older. I wanted to write a story about people who are 60, 70, 80, and how we disappear and yet we still have our faculties. So it's a book about young versus old, about experience versus those who are just starting off, those who know a lot and those who think they know a lot. It's that conflict between young and old, and also between the past and the future.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my other questions with the juxtaposition of the younger character. That was obviously intentional because you wanted to show, I guess, show those differences.
Yeah. Yeah, and well, I also love writing it because it's about my home state. There's
Yeah.
something very special about Maine. Why do so many spies retire here? What is it about this place? So it gave me a chance to talk up my state. I love it here because they respect your privacy. They let you live your life. They don't care what you're doing out in the woods as long as you don't bother anybody. And I can see why spies would want to come here in their retirement.
So you mentioned that Amazon Studios had bought the rights,
Uh-huh.
and I know, I guess maybe you can't discuss too much about what's going on, but are you going to be? Is the plan for you to be involved in any way as like an EP, as like writing some episodes, anything like that?
No, they have a pair of really, really good writers, the showrunners who also were the showrunners for the Peacock TV series Poker Face, two
Ooh.
sisters. And I got a peek at the uh, first script, and it's fantastic. They really nailed it. So I guess the next step is looking at talent. It's going to be a fairly, large cast because we have my five spies who are now in their 60s and 70s, but we also have to look at them in their younger years, 20, 30 years before. So it'll be like a double cast, young and old. Um, And then we have, of course, the wonderful people in my little Maine town.
And so we have the second book that's coming out next year, right?
March.
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 And on social media, you just shared the cover, I believe, for
Yeah,
both the US and the
yeah.
UK. Um, we don't want to, I guess, give too much away right now, but like, can you give a little bit sneak peek of what where the characters find themselves in the second book?
Yeah, it's the title is called The Summer Guests, and it's about some summer people. We have a lot of summer people who come up here. They just stay, for a month or two, and then they go home to their big city homes. And one of them is a teenage girl who disappears one day. And Maggie Bird, who is my main character, is drawn into the mystery because the number one suspect in the disappearance of this teenage girl is her really beloved lover, her beloved neighbor, who has saved her life in the previous book. And so she owes him. And she marshals the Martini Club, these retired spies, to help her solve the crime. Where is this teenage girl? And it really delves into not only CIA lore, but also the history of the CIA in Maine. What were they doing up here? And there's a little bit about that history in the story.
I don't want to get too far ahead of things, but is there going to be a third book?
I'm working on it now. It's it's not under contract because I kept holding him off. I said, you know what, give me some breathing space while I figure out what this third book is about. Well, I've already written 20 pages, so I guess it's moving ahead.
Nice. Very cool. So, okay, let's go back to titles.
Yeah.
You have some really great titles. I mean, the Spy Coast is a great title, and then the Martini Club. Have you, some authors, I kind of feel like, they'll title their book whatever, and then ultimately the publisher comes in and completely, gives a new title.
Mhm.
Like, how has your track record been with it over the
Um,
years?
yeah, my track record is about 50%. I think about half the time they take my title. Half the time they hate my title and they come up with a better title. So yeah, The Spy Coast was not my title. That was my editor's. And I thought after I thought about it, I realized, that is good. That is pretty good. So what I've learned is that titles are just so important. They're so vital. And I see a lot of self-published novels that are on Amazon. And I think that book will never sell because your title is terrible. And I think that the trouble with authors is that we get attached to our titles and we cannot see how bad they are. No matter how much people slap us around, we keep insisting it has to be that title. But I've learned to listen to the voice of editors and agents in this case.
Can you tell us what the initial title was?
Yeah, it was going to be Spyville.
Spider. Yeah, I think they made the right choice. Spy Coast. So what about the Martini Club? Was that always in the back of your head as like a potential, once you realize there's gonna be a second book? Like,
No,
I mean,
that
that's a
that
great
just
title, or that's a series title
that just
too.
showed up in the dialogue.
Mm.
It was like the cop was asking this group of spies, so you have a book group, do you? What do you call your book group? And they're like looking at each other because they don't really have a name. And somebody just says the Martini Club. So it came out of the dialogue, and I think everybody just kind of liked that. Thought, well, that's a good name for the series.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So obviously you're working on a third book now. It's not contracted, but I'm sure they're going to be, that's definitely going to go. So at this point, do you have other, I mean, you're working on this third book now. How many ideas kind of get stuck in your head where like you might just
Well,
have an
right
idea, like,
now
and how long does it usually sit until you're finally like, okay, I really have to like sit down and write this?
that varies. I mean, I have ideas that have sat with me for 10 years before I could figure out what to do with them. I have I have what I call my idea folder, and it's like clippings and tear sheets from magazines and newspapers that I know will make a good book. I just don't know what to do with them yet. I had one that was sitting there for 15 years before I came up with the story. So probably takes me on average a couple years for an idea to finally work its way into a book. And right now I'm busy doing other stuff. I have a screenwriter writing partner named Dan Rosen, and he and I have pitched a new television series that is getting interest, and we've had a couple of offers. So we may be
Ooh.
working on that next. It's for a TV series called Vacation Land. So
Is
I'm
there
hoping that
anything
works.
you can discuss? I mean, I don't want to jinx it or give too much away, but like, what type of genre, I guess, is it?
Comedy mystery. I don't know what
Huh?
humorous mystery. And it's very autobiographical. It's about an Asian detective from LAPD who resigns in disgust and moves to a little town in Maine, all the way across the country, and finds out that her crime fighting days are not over.
Ooh,
So it's a little bit about fish out of water, because when I
yeah.
first moved here, there were almost no Asians around me. And there was that adjustment as you learn to trust your neighbors, not to be prejudiced because they actually aren't. You just assume they are.
Yeah.
And then there's also that trust of them looking at the outsider and they're first saying, she's never going to last. And then after 20 winters go by, they think, oh, maybe she will. So it's really, I think of it as a love story between a woman and a place.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, again, there's so much we could go into, but I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day, which apparently was a good day because, like you said, you were like 1,000 words, which is really good. So, okay,
Yeah.
well, how about this though? You're currently then working on book three, but then you're also, I guess, doing this other screenwriting things. I mean, like, how do you like kind of juggle that, or do you find it's better to just focus on one thing at a
No, I
time?
like, I can write a screenplay and also write a book at the same time. And I can't do two books at a time, but I can write those two because they just feel so different. It's like I'll get, I can cook and I can also garden. Those they just feel different. Um, so I think I could do those simultaneously. The great thing about it is that because I'm not under contract for the book, I don't have a firm deadline and I can take a little longer for that. Um, if this script does get picked up, definitely, then that time frame is going to take precedence because that has definite deadlines.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. All right. So finally, if you could go back to your, back to the 80s, back to the future, I guess almost we would say, um, what, what type of, like, what have you learned that you feel is so important that you wish you would have known, like almost 40 years ago, either in terms of just like publishing, marketing, just writing in general, that you kind of felt like, oh God, I wish I would have, known this earlier. I may have, saved a lot of headache or whatever else.
I don't think there is anything. I think that everything had to be discovered in its time. Um, it's not something that you learn until you get to that fork in the road and then you make the choice and that's what you're going to be doing. So yeah, I get asked this question a lot and I can never give you an answer because I can't think of anything other than to say, um, just have confidence that you could do it. Every book starts with such a lack of confidence for me. It's always a challenge. It's always, will I be able to do this? Is this my last book? And then you get in the middle of it and you think, oh, now I remember what it is to ride this horse again. And you just learn to keep on doing it. I guess the other thing I would say is don't give up. Though that's important for every writer. Every writer needs to hear that. Don't give up. If you do give up because it's just you're discouraged, then maybe you weren't a writer to begin with, or maybe you were not meant to be a long-term writer. Because the writers I know would write no matter what.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That goes back to that idea of lack of confidence. I think goes back to longevity. I think it was Harlan Coben I had heard say, and I'm sure maybe other people have said it too, where um, only bad writers think they're good. Where I don't know about you,
Right.
but oftentimes it's like I'm working on a book and just I'm like, this is the worst thing I've ever written. And then,
He's right.
finally when you finish it and you go back through, you're like, okay, this isn't bad. But it's like, I don't know. I always personally get, worried when I feel very confident in a project because I'm like, oh no, this isn't good. Because if I'm really confident, it means it probably sucks.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very true. I will never let anybody see my drafts until it is the final draft because every draft before the final draft is so horrible. And I'd be so embarrassed to let anybody see those, especially the first draft.
So how much like revising do you do after you do your first draft? I mean, like how like you go back through it, or do you kind of edit as you go, where you sit down and
I
you
don't
read
I
what you
don't
wrote the
edit
day
as I go.
before? No?
Yeah, I have learned to not worry about editing until you get to the end. Um, because if you start editing before you get to the end, you'll slow yourself down. That first draft is all about forward progress, and you allow yourself to write a lousy first draft. I've heard someone say, call it, this is the vomit draft, where you
That's
just,
Nora Roberts.
was it Maura Roberts? I don't
I'm pretty
remember
sure
who.
Nora Roberts. Yeah, yeah. I love that
It's a
term,
great,
vomit draft.
it's really a good description. And so I just finished that first draft, and then I go back and then a lot of the times it's like completely restructuring for the second draft. I was counting out how many drafts I did for the last book. It was 7 drafts. Obviously the major revisions are from number 1 to number 2. And number 2 to number 3 sometimes are major revisions, but then later on it's just like little tweaks.
How much do you, I mean, like, how involved are you up until like publication? Like, I'm sure I kind of pissed off my publisher where it was like they sent me the final proof and I'm like, I just want to read through this one more time. And I found a few like typos or whatever else, but there are other things where just, it just sticks in my head and I'm like, can we change just like this sentence in this word because it's going to haunt me if we don't? I mean, like
Yeah.
at what point do you let go?
Oh, um, probably by galley stage. By galley stage, I think, oh, it's too late. I can't do anything about this. It's time to work on the next book. We could hold on to our books for decades
Oh yeah.
without letting them go because they're, I want to change something. No, you have to let it go. And flaws and all, it will make it out into the market, and you'll get nasty letters. Oh, did you know there was a typo? Did you know you're grammatically incorrect? Okay, so what? I've now written 10 big books since then. Um, so there's no perfection in this business either. There's no perfect book. Everybody gets a typo that slips in, and it's not anybody's fault. It's everybody's fault.
No, I remember I think it was Walter Mosley had said the way when he knows a book is done because he'll work on a book and then he'll go back through, make some changes, work on it, and then he'll go back through, and go back through. And he says, when I get to a place where I can't make any more changes, then it's done. And
Yeah.
I was like, oh yeah, I always like that. Yeah. So anyway, all right. Well, the most recent book is the most recent book is The Spy Coast, which is the first book in the Martini series. Second book, The Summer Guest, is going to be out next year. It's already up for pre-order everywhere, correct? So if people want
It
to
is
pre-order.
correct.
But
Yes, you can
hopefully
pre-order.
everybody can go pre-order it. Check out obviously Tess's great backlist. I had just listened to, if you're an audiobook fan, listen to Playing with Fire. Not only is it narrated by the great Julia Whalen, it includes some really great music included in the actual narration. Now, in the actual book, did you have like music there?
No.
Okay. Because I wasn't sure with you composing stuff if that was included in the actual text.
No, it wasn't. That would have been too difficult, I think, to include that in the text. But if anybody is interested in the sheet music, they can email me and I will be happy to send them the sheet music.
Yeah, that would be amazing. So again, Tess, thank you so much for spending time tonight. Congratulations again on the recent Thriller Master Award, and just again the longevity of your career. Definitely, not slowing down yet, which is just great. Hopefully, in the TV series that you have, actually the 2 TV series, hopefully everything moves forward with that. And yeah, everybody go check out Tessa's books. Although I imagine probably at this point everyone has checked out Tessa's books because part of your bio was you sold, what was it, 40 million copies? Is that correct?
Yeah,
That's
that's right.
that's not too shabby.
Longevity.
That's right. That's right. The longevity. So, all right. Again, Tess, thank you so much, everybody. You go check out her stuff, and yeah, see you next
Thank you
time.
very much. Okay,
Bye. Oops.
bye-bye.
Let me record this. Stop.